Hey everyone, this is Torpoint. I haven't made an update video for Ukraine in quite a while. I know I made my first one back in June-ish, where I was talking about specifically the offensive towards Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. Now, I was supposed to be making one kind of late July, August, where I would go over my predictions that I made during that time, but unfortunately I have been, well, swamped, I suppose. Now, as for what's been happening recently in regards to developments in Ukraine, two things have changed since last video. First one, I'm not going to be relying on Deep State Map as much because, frankly, if you've been keeping up, you know there's been problems with how much they've been reporting. They often lag behind when it comes to Russian advancements, while they also sometimes overestimate Ukrainian advancements. The second thing is another one of my sources I've been using is this map here by a guy called Russo-Ukrainian. You can find him on YouTube. He does very good updates. He uses geolocations. I find him to be quite reliable. Now, as for what I was saying last video, I was predicting that this area south of this reservoir would fall by the end of June. It is currently mid-September and this area is still being operated in by Ukrainians. They are being supplied across the reservoir itself using drones and small rafts, and they are currently stalling out the Russians in this southern area south of Konstantinivka. Now, this does come as quite a surprise to me, because I genuinely believe that the second that the Russians started encroaching on these areas, the Ukrainians would simply fall back to better defend Konstantinivka itself. But it seems that the Ukrainians have had a different idea, where if they keep their forces here in Klebenbik and Katerinivka, they can continue to hold the Russian forces down here, essentially hostage, forcing them to remain there instead of going to more active fronts, such as this breakthrough in the north of Pokrovsk, which immediately after it began, it's almost completely halted, because as the Russians attacked, the Ukrainians launched an attack of their own. As far as I'm aware, despite there being heavy fighting in this region, there's almost no movement whatsoever. This doesn't really affect much in the front line, but it does show that the Ukrainians have at least the strength to continue to counterattack to try and contain this breakthrough here. In particular, Russo-Ukrainian's map is now showing a bigger push towards trying to encircle this region. It seems that in his original video he was talking about them going through Novoekonomishne while pushing through the south to try and encircle this part here, but now with the recent developments here north of Pankivka, it looks like the Ukrainians are instead shifting their efforts to take just only this part here, encircle it, which does seem to be the best option they have on the table, because Novotoretsk is likely being held very heavily by the Russians. I doubt that they would be able to pull off an encirclement of this entire section of the front line, and currently they're just, with no progress being made towards Novotoretsk, it would be a better option to try and contain this smaller section instead. Another thing that I was not predicting last time was this incursion into the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. This came as quite a surprise to me, because especially given the fact that the Russians have been offering to hand back over land not within the 4 annexed oblasts back over to Ukraine as part of land transfers. But with this, it appears that they're now looking to occupy Dnipropetrovsk, at least partially, which then gives us two options as to what this could potentially mean. The first option is the most obvious, that they are still looking for the land transfer option, and that they're hoping to swap newly acquired territories within Dnipro in exchange for ones in the Donbass area in Donetsk. The second option is that they are now trying to expand into Dnipro to then shift this off the table, the idea of a land transfer off the table, the justification being that they'd occupied too much for them to just give it up, which would be in line with the theory that the only reason they are giving these small concessions is because they want for the Ukrainians to reject this offer to make them look bad, whereas if they were to actually surrender this territory, it wouldn't really do much for the Russians. It would barely cover anything in Donetsk itself. Another theory is that with the proposed ceasefire along the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblasts, this northern offensive here allows them to continue occupying regions along inside of Zaporizhia Oblast, which would then mean a solidifying of the front lines here. Ceasefire here would then give the Russians more in a potential peace deal, while also punishing the Ukrainians for not taking the Russians' initial offer of just an initial ceasefire along this front line here, with now the Ukrainians possibly ending up with Heliopoli threatened. Now, as for long-term advancements, it does seem that the Russians may be restarting offensives in the Vovchansk region, but it's unclear as to how much of an offensive they have there, given the flattened city. And you have some military mappers saying that there's massive plans for an offensive in the Kharkiv Oblast, but given that the Russians are also now stalling in the Sumy region, only having taken Kivka, which is not shown fully on this map, they took the entire settlement and now seemingly just perfectly content to just sit back and let the Ukrainians attack them on this strong position they have. Given that they seem to now no longer be focusing on these northern fronts, it would make sense to me that we'd be seeing more advancements within this main continuous front line down here. Another thing to note is that the Russians are now directly storming Kupiansk, which means that, well, it doesn't really mean much because the Ukrainians still control most of the city, and without controlling high-rise buildings within Kupiansk itself, the Russians are still not in a favourable position. But it could mean that the Russians are now trying to close this Ukrainian bulge, I suppose. I wouldn't really know what to call it, east of this river here. In doing so, they would then be able to open up offensives in the Kharkiv area. My point here being that don't expect any major offensives by Russia in Kharkiv until they have taken Kupiansk. Before they take that, there will be no major offensives, because they need this city both to supply their own forces as well as to then force the Ukrainians out and away, as well as then depriving them of their supplies, because then they'd then probably be setting up in Shevchenko over here, which wouldn't be too great, because that would mean they would then likely be conceding more territory over here to the Russians. As for Donetsk itself, it doesn't seem like there would be much happening around here, because the Russians were claiming that they would take all of Donetsk by the end of the year, but this is seemingly increasingly unlikely. As the winter sets in, the dirt roads will turn to mud and the front line will slow down almost completely, which is why there's such massive battles going on for this section here, as this will, if the Ukrainians can force the Russians back here, that will place Pokrovsk and Myrnahad in a much more easily to defend position, because when the winter sets in, the Russians will likely end up pooling all of their forces to take Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka in massive sieges, ready for the summer of 2026 to then continue. But progress is still slow across the entire front line. The only section of Donetsk that is quite notable in what's going on is in this northern area here, I think it was Toretska, or Torska, yeah, Torska, and the Serebryantski forest region, where the Russians have now been able to secure almost the entirety of it and can now flank Siversk from the north in the event of a further push. Another thing to note is that the Russians are now also closing on Liman after the fall of Torska. If you didn't know, the Russians first tried storming Torska from the north, but after the Ukrainian counterattack at the fish farms here, they then had to withdraw, only to then attack Torska again from this road here, where they've now taken the settlement in its entirety and are now trying to clear Zarishne. Different maps that you see will show different realities on the ground. For example, Weeb Union's map shows that they are occupying much more of Zarishne than other maps. I don't even know if Deep State map shows it being occupied. A little bit, but not lots. You know, you'll see different things from different people, because the front line is very much non-stable in this region. Both sides are constantly fighting for each individual house that you can see here, because they both know that in a case of Russian gain of Zarishne, they can then continue towards Liman. All in all, there's not really much progress to report in Ukraine, because frankly it's World War One in the 21st century. Lots of people are dying, not a lot of stuff is happening. The Ukrainians are growing weaker, but the Russians are growing more exhausted. The Ukrainians have recently announced that they're going to need £172 million every day to continue fighting this war, and they're expecting the West to pay most of this bill. Given that the United States has mostly cut off military aid to Ukraine, this is now likely to fall more to Europe, which will probably increase radicalisation in these nations as people are less willing to foot the bill for a war that they are increasingly seeing as being less of their importance than more domestic affairs. As for future predictions, I believe that the Russians will likely end up taking all four oblasts in their entirety, although I find it doubtful they would stop there, given that we've seen Russian published maps showing them owning Odessa as well. It seemed like that if any peace was made, the Russians would simply use it to mainly cross over into the Kherson Oblast and then continue fighting to take Odessa. All in all, there's not really much to say, if I'm honest. It's just more of the same. No one seems to be winning, but the Ukrainians are losing land. That's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to watch the previous episode, I suppose, but apart from that, that'll be it.